Hello everyone. My name is Daiichi, and I will give you a lecture regarding the radiation and remediation activities. So, let's start today's lecture. Today's theme is Restricted Areas, Past, Present, Future, Volume 1. Are you ready?
Hello. I am currently standing in front of the house of Mr. Suzuki, located in the restricted areas. Now I would like to hear from Mr. Suzuki, who has made his decision for his house to be dismantled. Mr. Suzuki, I have heard that your house will be soon dismantled, but how, and why, have you made this decision?
Well, I didn't want this house to be dismantled, because this is definitely my beloved house, but I have not been able to live in it for many years, due to the evacuation order. I couldn't bear to see the house deteriorate, so I had no choice but to make the decision for it to be dismantled.
Dismantling houses is definitely very difficult decision for everyone, but many people seem to have started their new life in different places by dismantling their houses, due to the long-lasting evacuation order to this date, in the restricted areas. For the next, I have just come to the area where the evacuation order of the restricted areas is about to be lifted today. Look, it has become at 7 AM, and the gate has been opened. The evacuation order of the restricted areas in this area has been just lifted, after more than 11 years have passed since the disaster. Now, a number of vehicles are, one after another, coming into the area where the evacuation order has been just earlier lifted. The number of people who will return to this area to live again seems to be still quite small, but it is expected that this area will gradually regain its prosperity in the pre-disaster time.
So now you have seen the news reporting the restricted areas, but how do you feel about it?
Well, I think that in the restricted areas, there are two kinds of areas: the areas where progress in reconstruction has been significantly made, as well as the areas where there are still a lot of issues to be addressed.
Yes, absolutely, you have got a point.
However, to be honest, I didn't know well that there are areas where evacuation orders still have not been lifted, and I am interested in what will happen to these areas in the future.
I see. So this time, after reviewing what the restricted areas are, and let me elaborate how the evacuation orders have been so far lifted, and what will happen to the areas in the future. Previously, I explained changes of the evacuation areas with time, but let us a bit recall it. The first evacuation order due to the accident of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station was declared on the day of the occurrence of the disaster, that is, March 11, 2011. Initially, evacuation order was declared in the area within 3 kilometers from the nuclear power station, and shelter indoor order was declared in the area between 3 kilometers and 10 kilometers from the nuclear power station. After that, situation of contamination, caused by radioactive materials released into the environment, had gradually become apparent, and accordingly, the evacuation areas had been also gradually expanded. And as of the end of September 2011, in addition to the restricted areas, the area within 20 kilometers from the nuclear power station, the deliberate evacuation areas were established, where cumulative dust during 1 year after the accident could possibly exceed 20 millisievert. Further to that, the evacuation preparation areas in case of emergency were also established, based on the shelter and door areas. Moreover, it had become apparent that other than these areas, there were spots where cumulative dust during 1 year after the accident could possibly exceed 20 millisievert. Therefore, the specific spots recommended for evacuation were established for each spot, and evacuation from the spots were supported.
I remember that. It was the period of time when the evacuation areas were the largest, right?
Correct. The evacuation areas were expanded to the areas of 12 municipalities, other than the specific spots recommended for evacuation. After that, based on the detailed monitoring for air dose rate of the areas, as well as coordination with local municipalities, the evacuation areas had been reorganized, during the period of around 2 years. The former restricted areas, the deliberate evacuation areas, and the evacuation preparation areas in case of emergency, had been reorganized into the restricted areas, the habitation restricted areas, and the preparation areas for lift of evacuation order, by August 2013.
I also remember that the former restricted areas, the deliberate evacuation areas, and the evacuation preparation areas in case of emergency, had been reorganized into the restricted areas, the habitation restricted areas, and the preparation areas for lift of evacuation order, in a step-by-step manner. Of these evacuation areas, I think that this time, the restricted areas will be focused on, but after all, what are all about the restricted areas?
This was previously explained, but key points for categorization of the evacuation areas, after the reorganization, are represented in this table. With regards to the restricted areas, the areas where cumulative dose possibly could not be less than 20 millisievert per year in 5 years, and also could be more than 50 millisievert per year at the time, were designated as the restricted areas. In the restricted areas, people were required to thoroughly evacuate, for example, by construction of barricades, but temporary entry of residents has been allowed, if the residents apply for it, and it is approved.
That's right. When I drove through the areas, just close to the restricted areas, sometimes security persons were there, and cars without permission were not allowed to enter the areas. And even if there were no security persons, barricades were constructed in front of the properties, to prevent people from entering into the areas. How much are the restricted areas still remaining to this date? Are the areas still there as they were, after the reorganization of the evacuation areas?
This time, as a review, I talked about basic points regarding the restricted areas. So next time I would like to talk about what has happened to the areas to this date, after the reorganization of the evacuation areas. So, let me wrap up my lecture by providing you the key points. Today, regarding the restricted areas, as a review, I talked about the history of the establishment, as well as the definition of the areas. The evacuation order was first declared on the day of the occurrence of the disaster, March 11, 2011. After that, as the situation of environmental contamination became gradually apparent, caused by the released radioactive materials, the evacuation areas were also gradually expanded, and the areas became the largest, in September 2011. After that, for example, based on the detailed survey on regional air dose rate, the evacuation areas were reviewed, and the 3 evacuation areas, the former restricted areas, the deliberate evacuation areas, and the evacuation preparation areas in case of emergency, had been in sequence recategorized into the restricted areas, the habitation restricted areas, and the preparation areas for lift of evacuation order. And the restricted areas were defined as the areas where the cumulative dose possibly could not be less than 20 millisievert per year in 5 years, and also could be more than 50 millisievert per year at the time. In the restricted areas, people were required to thoroughly evacuate, for example, by construction of barricades, but temporary entry of residents has been allowed, if the residents have got permission. Okay, today's lecture is now dismissed. See you next time. In this channel, the useful information regarding the radiation and remediation will be provided to you. If you like it, please subscribe to this channel, and do not forget to click the like button.